turn to our opening round table, examining the diplomatic realities of forced migration as it impacts Bangladesh and the greater region of South Asia. Our moderator for this session is Jeff Wiseman, who will introduce our speakers and lead the discussion which will follow their presentations. Throughout our conference, our audience members are encouraged to submit their questions to our speakers in writing through the Q&A portal that you will find at the bottom of your screen. The questions that you pose will be read by the moderator and addressed to the panelists at the conclusion of all the presentations of each session. So let me now turn things over to Jeff Wiseman, the moderator for our first session.
Thank you, David, and welcome everybody. It is an absolute pleasure to be joining this annual conference and to be meeting so many new people, even if online. Now, for our very first roundtable today on Bangladesh, I'm thoroughly delighted to introduce two leading scholars and a senior practitioner. First, we will be hearing from Professor Ranabir Samadar, who is currently the Distinguished Chair in Migration and Forced Migration Studies at the Calcutta Research Group. He is widely considered as one of the foremost theorists in the field of migration and forced migration studies, and his writings on migration, urbanization, political struggles, amongst many other topics, represented a major new turn in post-colonial thinking. Among his influential works, highly relevant to this conference are, and I'll just mention a couple, The Marginal Nation, Transborder Migration from Bangladesh to West Bengal, and The Post-Colonial Age of Migration. The second speaker, Nazreen Chowdhury, is a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Delhi, where she joins us from today. She received her doctorate from McGill University in Canada, and some of her significant publications are Refugees, Citizenship and Belonging, and some co-edited volumes on deterritorialized identities and transborder movement in South Asia, another on citizenship, nationalism and refugeehood of Rohingyas in Southern Asia, and on another one on gender identity and migration in India. She has another book in the works for 2025, I understand, titled New Frontiers in the Register of Migration and Refugee Studies. She's contributed to multiple journals, and she has previously served as the Vice President, if I've got this correct, the International Association for Studies on Forced Migration. Our third speaker is Mizanur Rahman, who is an additional secretary to the government of Bangladesh following a 2 decades long career with the Bangladesh Civil Service. Since September 2022, he's been the Refugee Relief and Repatriation Commissioner at Cox's Bazar under the Bangladesh Ministry of Disaster Management and Relief. Prior to that, Mizan served in several substantial roles as the additional Refugee Relief and Repatriation Commissioner from 2017 to 2020, administering the toughest phase of the Rohingya exodus from Myanmar to Bangladesh. Now, each of our three panelists will speak for about 13 to 15 minutes. And after that, we're very keen to involve you, the audience. So if you would like to make a comment or to ask a question, please direct your question to or comment to the speakers via the Q&A portal at the bottom of your screen, as David mentioned, rather than the chat feature. So with those tasks undertaken, let me first turn to Professor Ranabir Samadar. Ranabir, you are most welcome. We look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Professor Wiseman, and my thanks to also Dr. Wellman for this invitation. I'm also happy to have been invited because you do not find on many occasions scholars or peace activists discussing issues of refugee protection or migrant protection from the angle of diplomacy or discussing how diplomats should, tread on such matters. partly because and you may put it to my own prejudice, that I thought that diplomats are rarely very much concerned with issues of protection. They are concerned with population movement more and more, as we all know that from the angle of global governance, managing human mobility has become an important thing. And from that sense, I can well see how foreign policy establishments in various countries are scratching their heads and are vexed with the issue. But protection of the victims of forced migration, I'm still not very convinced that diplomats are very worried about it. They are worried to the extent that they will have a fallout. The issues of forced migration will have a fallout on the larger political and security scenario. You can think of the Balkan wars in the last decade of the preceding century. You can think of massive migration from Iraq. You can think of forced migration from Afghanistan, and several other issues. And in all these cases, generally, diplomats have been preoccupied or occupied with how to manage it and how to put these problems or the policies of managing these problems along the main lines of how would one put it, foreign policy establishment and foreign policy management. Initially, when I got this invitation, I was thinking that if I have to speak particularly something around Bangladesh, what would I do? What would I say? Because I have not worked specifically on that. However, I know that given the complexity and the intensity of Indo-Bangladesh relations, and having begun my work on migration by approaching the issues of transport and migration from Bangladesh to West Bengal, having written on the massive refugee flows to India in the wake of the Bangladesh war, I had something in mind what I could tell, but then I thought that there are certain larger issues involved, and given the time, maybe I may address, some of the issues or the three questions that have been put for our consideration. I may take together and try to engage with them from, let's say, from a southern point of view, or from a post-colonial point of view. So I shall avoid the specific diplomatic history of India and Bangladesh, which is no less interesting, no less intense, and no less conflictive. But I believe that with the general points that I want to make very briefly, they will be relevant to what I'm going to say. You see, in general, my own understanding is that diplomacy would not be, and the reason why I say that I'm very skeptic about any potential role of the diplomats or for diplomacy as an institutional practice of a country, very much with regard to migration management, or rather protection of the victims of forced migration, partly because, as we all know, it is a part of the foreign relations of a nation. It is also a part of international relations, and it's part of global politics. Refugee Convention of 1951 was a product of global politics. and irremediably part of foreign relations and international diplomacy of those years, if you recall at the beginning of the Cold War and the attention of the West to the problem of protecting the Cold War refugees. And then you go on with, let us say, the question of Afghan refugees or refugees, as I said, in the wake of the Bangladesh War of 1971, or come to our present time, how Frontex functions in Europe, how Europe approaches Turkey, or the Maghreb countries to ensure externalization of Europe's borders. If you think of the evolution of Indian attitude to refugees from Myanmar over the decades, attitude to boat refugees of the Southeast Asian nations, refugees in the Indian Ocean, or Tibetan refugees in India, one can go on and on with these instances. I think we will all agree that this is a very complicated picture where at one level, one could have said that this was the perfect hunting ground for the diplomats. But as I said, precisely because diplomacy is still rooted in national traditions and regional traditions, so you may think of the Euro-Atlantic tradition of diplomacy, even though I doubt that there is any single tradition of the Atlantic world. So all in all, diplomacy is a part of it. Without diplomacy, you cannot think of a global approach. On the other hand, this is such a complicated picture. I think it's beyond the ability of the diplomacy as the state of the art today. However, and this is what is interesting, that if you deconstruct this entire notion of diplomacy and leave aside, let us say, a solid or a monolithic idea of what diplomacy is and what this institution is all about, and if you lower down your attention to the meso level, things appear to be better coordinated. So think of Cartagena, or the African Charter of Human Rights, or for the Bali Convention for Prevention of Trafficking. Now, in all these, you find not only nation-to-nation, state-to-state coordination, but local coordinations, kin networks, logistical connections promoting human mobility, which therefore make these logistical connections make the host countries aware of the need to import labor, whether it is refugee labor or labor in form of the victims of forced displacement. You can find there, a vast area of which, for lack of better word could be called the area of practical ethics, the area of pragmatism, and certainly an area where the actors from, think of cities of refuge, this entire movement, global movement, or local communities, local states, local villages, transborder villages, or in the borderland areas, a much more Catholic approach to the triad of risk, uncertainties, and responsibility. Now, while global institutions protect humanitarian needs, there is no doubt about that. But again, continuing in the same vein, I would argue that regional understanding and state-to-state arrangements work better. Again, if you think of South Asia, Indira Gandhi's Shrimavu Bandhanayake Accord on Indian Tamil plantation workers, or again Indira Gandhi and Sheikh Mujib Accord on the enclaves in the Bangladesh border. There, in these cases, the actors are not worried very much whether they are protecting humanitarian needs or whether these address human rights principles. But on the other hand, if you think of UNHCR, a global institution, as I said, a product of global diplomacy, is it a human rights institution or humanitarian institution? You'd have to scratch your head to find an answer. And then if you think of the entire phenomenon of forced repatriation all across the world, the institution of offshore camps, let us say the Mediterranean interception, some researchers are saying that this is a revival of the old doctrine of Mare Clausel. What is now known as Pacific solution, management of IDP camps. And I mean, all these things, whether you are talking of non-governmental transnational institutions or transnational state institutions such as either the big states or the EU or the big refugee protection institutions, they show on one hand the configurations of power in what you understand as international in terms of international diplomacy. And on the other hand, when you think of the meso level and the local level, you think of other principles on which you may say diplomacy could have discovered its other side, which is namely legal pluralism, federal nature of dialogues, and movements like cities of refuge. So the net result is that on one hand, the humanitarian is complicit in the derogation of human rights. And law plays a crucial role in this derogation as the humanitarian is defined by law. So you may have a bombing of the humanitarian workers in Gaza, but diplomacy continues and diplomacy has nothing to do in that sense of stopping the bombing, except the meek efforts at UN General Assembly to condemn all these things. And these, as I said, being a part of foreign policy, international politics, this is as much as so much that diplomacy can do. To the last question, my, again, brief answer would be, all it means is that, yes, diplomacy can help us to rethink the role of mobility, migration, displacement, and economies, but it can, provided we defederalize the word diplomacy, remove the mystique and turn the idea into a practice of what I had called elsewhere in one of my books, called The Politics of Dialogues, into a practice of what can be called pluridialogues or plural dialogues, and inject the notion of the social in what is essentially a state-to-state game. Till that time, refugee protection will be a prisoner of this statist diplomatic game continuing from mid-19th century. I will end with another 2 minutes with, let's say, take the view that Kissinger took in his book on diplomacy. We all know it's a very famous book, but read the book, visit all the pages, you would not find the word migration or refugee there. And it is shocking. It is shocking in terms of the scholarship. It is shocking in terms of the framework or the approach. Now, on one hand, Kissinger, let us say, takes a historical view of diplomacy. But for him, diplomacy is hinged to this whole notion of balance of power. And therefore, even in the 19th century, you can read, or we all can read, how princes in the 18th century and early 19th century, they treated the cases of the runaway peasants or runaway mutineers or slaves or rebels from nearby other states or other kingdoms and how they managed it. But once you have hinged the question to balance of power, diplomacy is over for any practical use for issues like refugee protection, etc. So even though Kissinger, for example, continuing with the same example, same instance, you think of Treaty of Rapallo or Pact of Locarno or the Kellogg-Briand Pact, in all these cases, while the intention was to settle borders on both sides of Germany, or the border between Germany and Russia, or for that matter, outlawing war, you can see that this art of diplomacy, and based on so-called idea of our balance of power, have created the world today we live in. And from spanning more than 3 centuries of history, or 4 centuries of history, from Cardinal Richelieu, the father of the modern state system, to our what we call New World Order, diplomacy has very little room for issues like protection of the victims of forced migration. And I can end with that. If you think of the European history of refugee management after the First World War, clearly, again, the problem of minorities and the task of minority protection were often at the root of the issue of forced displacement at that time. And you remember Nansen International Office of Refugees, an organization established in 1930 by the League of Nations, internationally in charge of the management of particularly the stateless people, ensuring their at least local mobility. But in the history of diplomacy, you get to read League of Nations. You, of course, get to read a little bit of the Nansen Office, but hardly that takes the center stage by any means. Finally, then, if you think of global compacts, again, a large, amount of and a big degree of diplomatic activities went into making the global compacts. But by and large, the ink is hardly dry, but you can see its failure. So COVID-19 restrictions, Afghan refugees, Rohingyas, and in Europe, Lampedusa, Lesbos, these islands are now the burial sites of diplomacy. Frankly, then, the question that how do we tie, or how do we address mobility, migration, displacement, logistics, and economies? My final comment would be, given its present structure, this indissoluble link that ties these, 5 elements: mobility, migration, displacement, logistics, and economies, that link makes protection of migrants and refugees one of the hardest issues for global migration and refugee management regime to bite. And add to this the climate crisis. Who will be considered the climate refugees? And I end with Walter Kellen's, one of his, in fact, latest observation, that the 3 issues in protection: permissibility, feasibility, reasonableness, and the whole question of accepting people from countries or subregions faced with dire climate crisis, and ensuring the return in a safer environment. These seem to be a far call, given the way in which diplomacy is proceeding as a global institution. So maybe one needs to break it down and imagine a newer practice of the same thing. After all, it is as old as the history of politics is about. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranabir. That really was a wonderful introduction, and I'm so pleased that you mentioned, one of the basic flagship ideas in international relations, realism and its state centricity, and most, I think, graphically personified by Henry Kissinger. But I was also reminded, as you spoke, about Kissinger's role in the 1971 Independence War, and the now very famous book, The Blood Telegram, which is really kind of a fascinating example of how he turned his back so in such a Machiavellian way towards the millions of refugees at the time of in the early 1970s. So thank you very much for giving us that very nice marker to international relations and diplomacy. That really does set things off very, very nicely for us. Nazreen, I am now going to invite you from New Delhi to talk for 13 to 15 minutes, and we very much look forward to what you have to say. Thanks, Nazreen.
Thank you so much. Indeed, let me just acknowledge a couple of things. First is to both Professor Wellman and Professor Wiseman for this opportunity. Also to Professor Shamadar, because it is an honor to speak after him. It's because most of our discussions on this subject, to be very honest, has definitely been shaped by his scholarship. So you will have to bear with me if I'm a bit biased. But I think it is that one of the things, and of course, probably Mr. Rahman doesn't recognize, but I was a PhD student when I had actually talked about the Chakma refugees, which was successfully repatriated from India to Bangladesh. So indeed, this is a great moment for me, to be very honest. So I take this opportunity to acknowledge my gratitude. Having said that, on a subject that has been, put forward for me to discuss, and I take a cue from Professor Shamadar, and I call him Ranobidda, so that's what I'm going to call him, from Ranobidda, is taking the cue from Global Compact. So Global Compact, in one sense, actually was one of the markers of what the states were attempting to do in order to figure out the question of mobility of refugees and for the migrants. So it was an attempt to develop an organized approach for the administration and management of burgeoning number of refugees and migrants created due to conflict, war, human rights violation, targeted by persecution, and adverse environmental impact due to climate change. However, contrary to the situation of post-World War scenario, the number of refugees who seek refuge and settlement in the countries of Europe and that of global North are relatively low in comparison to nearly 85% of them that are hosted in Global South. The Global South, therefore, in general, and more specifically, I will say the Southern Asia, the term that we are very interested in developing, which encompasses not only the South Asia, but also the Southeast Asian states, which actually have an equal and more refugees within their territory than probably we can think of. In the context of having only very limited access to safe places for permanent resettlement or inability to contrive conditions that facilitate sustainable repatriation, refugee population poses, therefore, an inimitable predicament for countries of Global South. So therefore, we can say that except for the underbellies, most of countries which are kind of seeking a sense of responsibility, our responsibility to protect seems to be slightly lopsided. So this is a context that I wanted to kind of place it very much out there to understand where the problem lies. Now, my talking points is very much shaped by the question that was given. And I think in the middle of all of this, what is very interesting is the learning that is emerging from various parts of the world, be it within South Asia, or we can say Southeast Asia or the Southern Asia. Now, if refugees are moving towards an area which is obviously where they are persecuted and they're crossing over. So the question of diplomacy is therefore very, very interesting. So the three questions that have been sent, or which shapes this conference is actually the hallmark of my presentation. To the first, I would just like to say the role of practitioners. I would say practitioners actually have a very, very critical role in mitigating this situation. However, while at one hand, there is an opportunity for humanitarian assistance and facilitating and negotiating with the state and the non-state, states do not necessarily like migration and mobility of population across the borders, especially, let's say, irregular migration in terms of its citizen, because they tend to somewhat create a challenge for the sovereignty. So therefore, the question is, where is the room or opportunity for diplomacy to act here, especially when you have mobility across borders between two countries, and let's say specifically in the context of South Asia, if you want to put it that way, or the irregular migration that has happened between Bangladesh and India became a flashpoint, especially in the state of Assam, where the national register of citizens were created to figure out who is the citizen. So therefore, I am kind of challenged by this question of diplomacy and the role of diplomats. And secondly, is how far would nation state allow them to have that kind of an opportunity to maneuver, to navigate, or to negotiate. So therefore, we can say the kind of diplomatic intervention or diplomatic initiative that we say is very much state-centric. So having a very overt state-centric is perhaps a problem that needs to be addressed, understood, and maybe, unraveled a bit. What I found fascinating in the middle of all of this was there is an opportunity of something which I was reading not so long ago, was something called the everyday forms of diplomatic activities, which perhaps rises from the societal level. So there are societal actors who play a kind of a critical role in navigating the day-to-day activities of migrants who have been, let's say, crossed over from, let's say, state A to state B, and the state B is hostile. Even if the state B is hostile, what we find it fascinating is local bodies coming together to provide hospitality, and which is kind of going against the norm of what we would presume the state-centric notion of protection per se. And there have been ample opportunities coming from the South Asian context where I can demonstrate, and I hope to demonstrate in the next few minutes that I have. So what is fascinating for me is South Asian region is one of the regions where it does not necessarily have or is party to any of the convention of the Refugee Protection Convention. But despite that, it seems to be having a very large number of refugee groups, be it in the context of Pakistan, be it in the context, I'm not even talking about the partition refugees here. And presently what we have, the Rohingya situation in Bangladesh, and then coming to India, which is a fairly smaller number, but nonetheless a number that is creating some kind of tension within the country itself. Now, whether the tension is something that we need to talk about, or is it just a media hype, that is of course very much debatable. So who are these societal actors that are playing a very, very critical role, and who are these practitioners of diplomacy here? The practitioner of diplomacy here, what I find is a directive that was sent by the government of India to one of the states, northeastern states, was that the borders would not allow anybody to enter. Now, one of the states, especially in the state of Mizoram, they went against that diktat. And they actually said that, given the traditional nature of understanding of hospitality that we have, we are kind of custom bound to allow these people to come in. They were, of course, very smaller in number. There were 6 to 7 families, and it became a flashpoint. It became a flashpoint with the government. But what really was interesting was when the matter was referred to court, the court basically accepted their jurisdiction and to understand that, yes, indeed, local bodies have that opportunity and should be given that, in a manner in which, let's say, there's a dialogic conversation that is there, which is very much prevalent, and they have accepted it. So what we have is a very interesting learning that is emerging, that where the state-centric notion seems to be going in one direction, there seems to be local and perhaps societal actors that can play a very, very critical role. Of course, one may argue that they might not have a longevity, they may not have, it may not sustain the momentum to reach a penultimate, outcome. But for scholars such as us, it is very heartening to see that where diplomacy on an overall context is not taking up the story, there are other mechanisms that is very much prevalent, which I find is interesting. Now, moving to the next question that it was raised, that what kind of institutions? Now, we have to understand that, forced migration by its very definition is challenging the, sovereignty question, citizenship question, identity question. And I think, other than the, in the global South, in Southern Asia or South Asia, we are much more exposed to it because we have a border which is kind of porous in some areas, and borders which allow kind of even some kind of entry exit, which is there. And if you were to, not so long ago, between India and Myanmar, it's very recently that the government of India basically suggested that we will have now a barbed wire there, which meant basically there was an open border concept where people were just coming in to sell their products. So there's a very strong sense of economy that is driving both the sides of India and the Myanmar side. But you have to also understand northeastern parts of India, certain parts of India, the country, the household is such that some parts are on the other side and some parts on the Indian side. So there is a certain degree of, not only, I would say, porousness does not quite explain it, but perhaps certain kind of accommodation that is going on at that level, even by the state itself, to understand how far the state responsibility would be. Now, therefore, the question, therefore, for us is, where does all of this lead to, and why are we not showcasing these, interesting stories which is emerging from, let's say, around the borderland areas, around border areas? Now, I want to bring this question back to Indo-Bangladesh a bit. So in the domain of the second question that you've raised, what kind of role? Normally, one would say that, intergovernmental bodies or large NGOs or, all of that has a very interesting role. Yes, it does have an interesting role, but somewhat when it comes to, conflicting of sovereignty, state interest will prevail over the rest. So therefore, earlier Professor Shamardar was talking about the role of UNHCR. Now, UNHCR has a very, very limited role in India. And one of the stories that goes, again, to the best of my knowledge, what I've understood is it is a body that is often called by the government of India in some matter. So in other words, even if they have a mandate, they quite cannot go that entire way that they want to, let's say in some other states. So given their limited context, they are a body that is providing a kind of identity, whether it's biometric identity or what in the case of the Rohingyas or in the case of the Afghans, where they provide a particular card that allows them to move from point A to point B within the country itself. So sometimes what happens is responses are very, very critical. And in the case of, let's say, typically in the case of, let's say, Bangladesh. Now, Bangladesh it's a very interesting story here, because Bangladesh, given its limited resources and, of course, the present day context, it is facing a huge influx of, Rohingya refugees for a really, really long time. So it actually showcases a very important example of regional diplomacy, which has kind of been able to balance humanitarianism on one hand, and to some extent, probably keeping this, the issue of the Rohingya afloat. Of course, one of the challenges would be is what next? And whether, the second, the last group of refugees that has come in, whether they would be repatriated or they will be relocated. Lately, I just heard that there would be a question of resettlement. So that would be interesting to see. And perhaps we can hear more from Mr. Rahman when he talks about what would be the situation for the Rohingyas, especially when there has been a big gap of the Rohingya refugees who came in the 80s and those who came later in 2015, 16 onwards. So how do we therefore navigate? But nonetheless, one cannot deny the fact that the country has done pretty well in terms of managing the refugee group and the manner in which they are able to give voices to the refugee community. And I will, how much time do I have? Sorry, you're muted.
You do have a few minutes, so that's all right.
Okay,
you do have a few minutes.
Okay, thank you. So one other aspect, therefore, I want to bring into this is the idea of migrant activism. Now, one of the aspects that most communities, refugee communities, are navigating in the absence of the 51 Convention, because there isn't a law that guides their protection regime. But the state law actually, guides the nature of protection that the refugee community is supposed to face. So migrant activism or refugee activism, if you want to put it, and more specifically, I want to draw your attention to the concept of radio that, the Rohingya communities have been able to utilize in not only in Cox's Bazar area, but also in Southeast Asia also. So this actually allows them to kind of not only stay in touch with the community at large and to figure out what is going on, but also to build bridges. And this everyday ambassadorship is something that I find very interesting, because they kind of take into account the everyday life that they're leading within camps, be it, if they're not getting help on time, or there could be just stories that they feel connected based on their cultural identity that they feel, who are scattered all over the world, the Rohingya refugees who are there. In terms of, so therefore, this is something which is very much connected to, the kind of digital network that they are forming, and the manner in which not only the community are indeed staying together, but they are able to promote a kind of, and I think various organizations are involved in this, and I'm told not only the international, but at the local bodies also, which facilitates this storytelling, because in some sense, it allows them to mitigate the trauma that they have faced in their own country of origin at that level. So therefore, we can say that, in some sense, diplomacy therefore should not be just viewed as what somebody has called it as a static, immemorial, institutions. Rather, it is much more. It can evolve. There can be opportunity to do so, but of course, there has to be mechanism to support that structure, and wherein, in some sense, there should be political learning that is emerging, and also communities are given the opportunity to showcase the uniqueness that is there. See, South Asia actually hosts quite a large number of refugees. If you want to talk about the Afghans and the Chakmas, that, the case that I wanted to talk about, that I was, my own work was on, is something that, is something where one of the successful cases of repatriation, and one of the reasons they were supposedly success within quotes, is they were completely repatriated to Chittagong Hill Tract from Tripura state, because there was an opportunity for the refugee community based on the trilateral agreement or tripartite agreement, where the community leader at that point, Upendra Lal Chakma, who went to this country of origin and witnessed that everything was fine, and he was able to motivate and influence his refugee brothers and sisters to return. Of course, this is another story as to what is happening to them today and what is happening to where they are. But nonetheless, I would just say one line and then I will end, is my understanding of diplomacy, of what it was and what I had, what I understood now, is there are a lot of opportunities to do so. But again, it has to move away from the state-centric identity to state-centric idea to perhaps little more societal understanding, or maybe make it state society, wherein state is there, but it is perhaps more driven by societal norms and customs and tradition. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Nazreen, thank you very much indeed for a very rich explanation of what's happening in South Asia. But I'm also delighted that you helped develop, a conceptual framework for our conversation today and tomorrow, and that is that, in stark contrast to Kissinger's state-centric realism, which was not just simply state centricity about all states. It was state centricity about certain states, great powers. And that was Kissinger's, main focus, of course, and European great powers to boot. But I'm very pleased that you're able to cast the contrast between Kissinger's great power state centricity with this idea of everyday levels of diplomacy that Kostas Konstantinou, who you reference, has written extensively about, and which does form quite a bit of our work here at the Grace School. And it basically opens up, this basic question: well, what is diplomacy? Who conducts diplomacy, and who are the diplomats? And once, as you invited us to do, once you go down that path, then problems, I think, become at least potentially a little more manageable. So thank you very much for that fascinating talk. So I now turn to our third speaker, Mizran Rahman. And Mizran, you have about 13 to 15 minutes, and we very much look forward to hearing your thoughts as well. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Jeff. And of course, I must be thankful to David and Mildred for inviting me and encouraging me to be part of this conference. And I have been delighted to be part of this conference alongside the Professor Ranavir Samaddar and also Nazneen Chaudhary Professor. So thank you very much, all the audience also. for listening to me and will be listening to me. I will be concentrating on what I have been doing actually as a practitioner here in Cox's Bazar. I was posted here in 2017 when the large influx started. And I had been here for 2.5 years as deputy of this office. And before that, actually, I was in the field when actually I had to work with the UN colleagues in the field for setting up the camps. And later on, I was posted somewhere else as I am civil servant. So this time also, it is almost 2 years I have joined as Refugee Relief and Repatriation Commissioner. In our country, it is popularly known as TRIPOLS. So I cannot theorize these things as our academicians, expert to do that. But what I will be doing, I will be just presenting some crude realities, information, and facts in front of you. So I will be presenting on my presentation. I have a preparation to present on presentation. So let me share my presentation. So can you help me? Are you okay with the presentation? Are you seeing it? Jeff, I'm not hearing you.
I can see your slide very carefully, very clearly, I should say. So please press ahead.
Okay, so my topic is actually as the Rohingya crisis started. So how actually we managing, the camp and the huge influx, more than 1 million population who came from Myanmar, the neighboring state, which is previously known as Arakan, now it is Rakhine state. And where I'm sitting in now, Cox's Bazar, it is one of the 64 districts of Bangladesh. It is the southern, part, and the last 2 sub-districts, Ukhi and Teknaf, is occupied by the Rohingya community, shelters. This is the camps. So before going to my presentation, I can give you some idea about the Rohingya community. Actually, as academicians are very much aware of this. This community has been made stateless, and they have been originated to Myanmar, Rakhine state, the previously known as Arakan, and their root is not less than even 700 years in that territory. But somehow they were called as Bengali intruders and Bengali people, or they have some other actually slang language they address. Myanmar is a country of ethnic minority groups. 135 ethnic minority groups are living, divided into 8 or 9 major groups. One of the major groups is Rakhine. So they are not actually considered as the ethnic minority group in Myanmar. So as per their national citizenship act, so somehow they have been disenfranchised. So my presentation will be covering, sorry. So some history, some brief information about this Rohingya community, and also main focus will be the administration and management. and humanitarian activities. So as I was talking about their history, so they are very old in that part of the globe, and there was some information we collected that first of all in 1799 this Rohingya word was found in Francis Buchanan, the famous book. The influx started, in fact, in 1784 when Burmese king Budapaya invaded Arakan, then Arakan, and people started coming to this part, and the British government sent one of their officers whose name was Captain Hiram Cox. And after his name, actually, this area is known as Cox's Bazar. So actually, the history of influx, the history of Cox's Bazar is the history of influx, in fact. So always the people came crossing the Naf River, came here since 1784. And later on in 1824, there was the Indo-Burma War, and it was annexed by the British government. And later on, when 1948, 1942, during the Second World War, there was another influx, and Japan actually occupied the whole area. And there was a massacre also, because the Rohingya community actually took the part of Britishers. So again, there was another influx happened. And after 1948, when actually the Burma became independent, and there was a 3 consecutive parliamentary election, and Rohingyas were actually part of that democratic practices, and many of their community members were elected as the members of parliament. And surprisingly, what we know now that they are very illiterate, they are not that much oriented with the politics and other things. But we found that the one of 2 women parliamentary members from the Rohingya community. So that was the history. So I just give you some historical timeline of the influx. In fact, their ordeal started in 1961 when the military took over, and the first influx after our independence of Bangladesh is the 1978, and later on it is 1992, and from 2012 there was a small scale, influx happened, but finally the big influx was in 2017, and government actually initially tried to stop the influx from our side. Our border border guard actually tried to BDR and border guard, they tried to actually prevent the influx. But as this area is the Muslim dominated area, and Rohingya community belong to the Muslim community, so government found this very difficult to actually stop the influx, and there was a pressure from the our domestic side. So finally, government actually accept the huge population, and I think it was a Rohingya. The figure is huge, 850,000 in the 2017 influx. It's huge influx, and what is the some information regarding the now management is that we have 34 camps, 33 in Ukhi and Teknaf, 1 is in Bhashanchar, and these 2 sub-districts as the Slim Peninsula. In one side it is the Bay of Bengal, and another side is the Naf River and the border. And the camp settlement is in a very difficult terrain. Actually, it is a hilly, and hill is muddy. It's a sandy hill. So, and it was a reserve forest. Actually, we had to cut all the trees, and to some extent we had to cut the hills also, for saving the human lives actually at that time. So now you might have heard the the incident. This monsoon also, we lost 16 people because of the landslides. And this is the demographic scenario in our in the camps. It's huge actually. The 49% male, 51% are the female, and the 52% are the below 18 years old. And how actually we manage the camp administration and coordination, that is a big question to many people. It's a very complex management system in the field. So I can give you some of insights from our management point of view. In the middle, you see my office, the Refugee Relief and Repatriation Commissioner. This office was established after the second influx that is in 1992. It was under the Ministry of Disaster Management and Relief, and it is connected with the UN agency UNHCR actually. My officers are coming from different ministry. In particular, Ministry of Public Administration. They actually give me office. Presently, I have 42 civil servants, and they came from the Ministry of Public Administration. And I have to work under the supervision of the Ministry of Disaster Management, though, but I have to actually, mainly my activities are under with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, because the bilateral issues, the other issues, they are dealing with since they are the professional diplomats. And I have many things to work with the Ministry of Home Affairs, as the law and order is the issue that is the actually sole responsibility of the country. So we have to manage the law and order here. As the people came from a very, very complex situation, they were subjugated to, torture, atrocities, and they're the, genocide survivors. So they came with the many trauma and, many, mental disposition is not that very good. So the law and order is a big issue in the camp. So we have deployed 3 battalion of armed police battalion under the senior officials, and we have to work with them. I have to work with them also, and other related ministries, and also Prime Minister's office, now Chief Advisor's office at Dhaka level. And at Dhaka level, we have a strategic executive group led by UN resident coordinator, UNHCR, IOM, and one representative from NGO, INGO, is the members of SAC. So on my right, you see the Armed Force Division is also very crucial, because when influx started, it was a massive influx. Within a very short time, we had to receive huge population. So in aid to civil power, military was deployed, and they actually help us in distributing the relief and other commodities among the refugees. And we have the police, we have the Department of Public Health for wash facilities. We have health department, is a huge tax actually on the shoulder of health department, because these people came with the diphtheria that was unknown in our country for 2 decades. So Rohingya community actually deprived of basic rights, including health, back their home. So they were not that much immunized actually. So we had to cover them with various vaccination programs. And of course, the Deputy Commissioner Office, the district level, and other related department also. And on my left, it is the Intersector Coordination Group. It is led by UN agencies. And we have 9 to 10 UN agencies, 150, INGO and NGOs. So they have their, coordination umbrella here in Cox's Bazar. So they are directly supervised by the SAC, but here as a, horizontally, we have to work with every organizations, my office, and also with, as a whole, the coordination groups. This is very important coordination actually mechanism by the UN agency here. And you see at the bottom level, I have my officers who are called camp in charge. So they are deputy secretary or the senior secretaries. They are the camp in charge, and they are actually focal at the camp level, and they're working with site management partners and service providers who are actually funded by different UN agency, or they individually collecting fund from abroad through NGO-FES group. We call it FD7 foreign donation form number 7 for emergency purpose, and for development purpose form number 6. So my colleague who are at the camp level, they are coordinating with all the actors in a single camp. There are more than 25, 30, even around 40 actors are working in different sectors. We have a sectoral approach. One is the health, another one is the education, the shelter, and the wash, these sort of 9 sectors, major sectors, some working groups are working. And what I can tell you, as our professors was mentioning some, limitation or the practitioners, that is, we have, of course, the UN agencies are working here and with their, a lot of experience of working in different area of the globe. But what we have been actually facing here, that is in 2017, particular in 2018, early 2018, the officers of UN agency who came from Mosul of Iraq or South Sudan or Yemen, they came here as the emergency was declared as level 3 emergency. So the very senior officers came from different organizations. What I found personally in the field level, there was a tussle with the government officers and the UN agency or ING officials who came from the other part, because they came with the mindset that, from a place actually they came where government was not very strong, actually, or there was no government even. So when they came here, there was a tussle with the government officers, as there is a strong governmental supervision is in the field. So that, but one thing I must confess, that is that as a civil servant, we actually have not been trained to work in a humanitarian, context, because we have been trained to work for our own people, and it's a different, dimension. But here, actually, without having any training, we came here, but somehow we have been enlightened by our colleagues from different humanitarian organizations, UN agency, UN, and still we are in a learning process. So that is a limitation or the shortcoming of our government officers. But what we can do, that is the management side, that is important, because we have been trained for that. So say UN agency and NGO, INGO, they are working a lot in the camps, but there is the supervision from the government side, and government focally is actually coordinating the all activities in the camps. So these are the 3 committees who are the responsible for supervising the whole activity. The National Committee, it was formed in 2020, headed by the Minister, Honorable Minister of Home Affairs, and the related ministers, state ministers, secretaries are the committee member, and from field level, me and a divisional commissioner are the members of this national committee. And another committee is the National Task Force, headed by Foreign Secretary. In the first committee, actually, the UN agency or INGO, they are not the members of this committee. It's only the government officials are the members. But in the second committee, National Task Force, headed by the Foreign Secretary, we have the members from UN agency and also from some ING. And from field level, me and the the DIG of police and the deputy commissioner. They are from the members from the field level. And this task force actually is the policy-making body for the camp management and camp interventions and some policy interventions also. And third committee is headed by a divisional commissioner, which is called executive committee. They actually all meeting every month. Just review the whole situation of camp management, and all the actors from the government side are the members of this committee. No NGO, INGO, or UN agency are the member of this committee. Then who are the actors in the field? From government side, you see the UN intelligence agency, the police, deputy commissioner, social service, civil surgeon, Ministry of Women and Children Affairs, Department of Family Planning, even the Islamic Foundation, they are involved here. And from UN agency, these are the organization. INGO, now it is 48, and NGOs 100. Except all those, we have IFRC, ICRC, BDRC, Bangladesh Red Crescent Society, World Bank, Asian Development, International Court of Justice, National Court of Criminal, JICA, GIZ, TICA, AFAD, DNR. These, all the actors from government, from UN, from NGO, from INGO, from humanitarian agency, bilateral agency. So RRC, my office is the responsible to coordinate all the actors, state, non-state, all the actors at the field level. These are the fund flow system, UN fund, NGO Affairs Guru fund, foreign government funded, the bilateral through bilateral organization, World Bank, Asian Development Bank, some grants, some loan, and local charity and individual. Here the fund flow is not very good, so going down. What is the role of my office? These are the role of my office, in fact, what we are doing at the field level. We call Rohingya here forcibly displaced Myanmar nationals. As we, as Bangladesh actually did not declare them refugee as the 51 convention, Bangladesh is not the signatory. So my office has been working, but we have some refugee also who are declared refugee who came in 1992. They are living in 2 registered camp. We call them registered camp. So they are called refugee, but the other are called forcibly displaced Myanmar nationals. So
Ms. Ram, this is Jeff. This is Jeff with a diplomatic intervention, I'm afraid to say. We are running up against our time, I'm afraid. And what I'm wondering is, look, what you're showing with your slides is just, the multitude of actors is really fascinating. I wonder if this is something that you would be able to share with our participants after the event, because I think just showing the complexity through your slides is really, something that you really are emphasizing in your presentation. So I wonder if you could take one more minute, and then we'll need to take a question or two before our break. Thanks.
Okay, I'm finishing. Okay. So this is the role of my colleagues at the camp level. And how actually we connect with the refugee people at the ground level. So these are the pathway. So how can these are the pathway to connect the people who are in need, who are there at the household level. Okay. These are the sectors, major sectors. These are the different sectors actually. $12.5 is per head per month. That is the WFP minimum food package. Nutrition sector, education is the Bangladesh has actually allowed the Myanmar curriculum to be studied in the camp. We have more than 400,000 students, eligible students, and we have more than 8,000 teachers teaching them in the camps, the Myanmar curriculum. Health is the big sector. Okay. Livelihood, we actually recently we started the livelihood projects because there was a livelihood framework actually policy intervention from National Task Force, and we started the different livelihood training and some lower scale actually livelihood project. The activities are in the camp, so there's the challenge: how can we scale up all those livelihood projects in the camp, as we could not repatriate a single person in the last 7 years. That is the big challenge for us. So we did many things. You know, the upper picture is the 2018, 17, and now 2023, you know, reforestation program. These are, so we have been engaging them in various activities like, you know, football competition from our office. And this is the one, you know, picture of football competition. And, you know,
Okay, Mizan, thank you very much. I'm going to jump in at this point. Thank you so much for taking us through that speed slideshow. Really do. I think it has given us an idea of the complexity of the situation that you face there.